Hello. I recently had a very good discussion with Peter Boghossian in which we discussed wokeism as the modern manifestation of oikophobia, religion versus shared beliefs, the decline of induction, and other subjects. I link to that conversation below. We also discussed what Boghossian calls the substitution hypothesis, which is the idea that when religion collapses, it is substituted by some other religion or by some religion-like phenomenon rather than by science or by a greater devotion to reason. Many atheists of the more militant type have believed that their fight against religion could yield a more rational and scientific-minded society. In the discussion with Boghossian, I basically gave the answer that the substitution hypothesis is true. But since this seems to be a popular subject nowadays, I thought I'd flesh out that argument a little bit more for this video. So, here goes. It is a common misconception that contemporary Western society is the first to be atheistic. An otherwise very sound authority, who does a lot of good work, Jonathan Haidt, wrote in his The Righteous Mind that societies that forego the exoskeleton of religion should reflect carefully on what will happen to them over several generations. We don't really know because the first atheistic societies have only emerged in Europe in the last few decades. Haidt's first sentence is true enough. They should reflect carefully. But not the second sentence, because in fact, we do know. We learn more about our own Western society when we look back at history and see that mass atheism has developed in the past, even if not to quite as extreme degrees as in current times. When atheism did develop on a mass level, social decline and moral deracination was always the result. In late 5th century and early 4th century BC Athens, moral relativism was all the rage among intellectuals, and a rejection of belief in the traditional gods was common. Plato, for instance, complains in his Laws that scientists have convinced people that the gods are false, and he laments that the laws must be changed to account for the fact that the populace is consequently becoming less virtuous. Although one may of course look today with some sympathy upon an ancient scientist who explained that the sun has actually nothing to do with some fairy tale being called Apollo, it is clear that the collapse of religious belief would prove detrimental to the community in which it had been held. As religious belief in Athens declined, it dragged other traditions down with it as well, and was progressively replaced by oikophobia, cultural self-hate, and by androgyny, and by an exaggerated egalitarianism that weakened Athens' capacity for resistance to outside threats as the 4th century wore on. It is not a coincidence, for example, that the philosopher Theodorus of Cyrene, who was also an atheist, also ridiculed patriotism and seems to have defended moral relativism. This does not mean, of course, that there is a necessary connection between atheism and relativism, but history does show that on a mass level, societies where atheism increases also see more relativism and more oikophobia, more cultural self-hate. In a corresponding era in Rome, learned men began to question traditional faith, whereas previously Rome had always prided herself on her piety. Varro, in the 1st century BC, interpreted the gods euhemeristically, that is, as having originally been humans who were subsequently idealized. And in the late 1st and early 2nd century AD, atheism became increasingly common, with, for example, the historian Tacitus in his Annals viewing religion as something old-fashioned and quaint, and describing how traditional belief was collapsing already in the mid-1st century AD. Roman religion had taken shape in a small agrarian community, which imposes a certain harshness and discipline on its members. The religion formed under such circumstances laid a strong emphasis on ritual and obligation, and was not suited for the easy and comfortable lifestyle of a wealthy imperial city. In urban opulence in Rome, people developed much more individual and fragmented emotional needs, and they turned to atheism and sometimes to foreign gods instead. But since people continue to have spiritual needs, and this is really the important point, since people continue to have spiritual needs, traditional Roman religion was not replaced by more reason, whatever that's even supposed to mean, but by an exaggerated individualism, by pop spiritualism, by androgyny, and by the pseudosciences of astrology, fortune-telling, and physiognomy. mass atheism appeared again in mid and late 18th century France, and in that case, of course, concerned Christianity. The marginalization of religion began to become more acceptable in polite society already under Louis XIV, but it was especially around the time of the launch of the Enlightenment Encyclopedia in 1751 that not only atheism but a distinct anti-religiousness began to grow prevalent. Since religion and society are always closely linked, atheism became infused with oikophobia, as for example when Voltaire, in his essay on the manners and spirit of nations, expressed his hatred of Christianity but had kind words for other religions, especially Hinduism. That is, atheism leads to cultural self-rejection on a mass level. The Enlightenment transformed French attitudes to tradition in general, to social morality, sexuality, and much else, with public degeneracy becoming increasingly common. This spread of atheism and its concomitant destruction of social values would, of course, facilitate the complete collapse of the old order, the Ancien Régime, of French society as a whole in the French Revolution. That is, the spread of atheism does not lead to that much reduction in conviction or fanaticism, but only to a redirection of human energy toward other goals. Instead of religion, educated Frenchmen invested themselves in relativism, cultural self-flagellation, and effeminacy. Similarly, in fin de siècle Europe and late 19th century America, there was a marked weakening of the church through the popularization of scientific and philosophical materialism. And this did not lead to a more rational or scientific community, but to a rise in various superstitious cults and sects, such as theosophy and various occult movements. That is, as traditional religion receded, a motley group of superstitions rushed in to fill the vacuum, because people need something transcendent. It is worth pointing out here that the French Enlightenment did not only emphasize science and reason, as is commonly said, but that it also appropriated reason for progressive, anti-religious, and oikophobic or self-hating ends. That is, it mixed reason with belief and opinion under the guise of reason alone, with the result that some people came to think that there is something intrinsically irrational or anti-reason about faith in a deity, which there is not. The specter of 18th century atheism and of the erroneous belief that reason points in a particular socio-political direction haunts us to this day. This belief that reason points in a particular socio-political direction can be seen today, of course, in the guise of various experts and scientists arguing that their preferred policy options are dictated by science and by reason. I'm sure everyone knows what I mean, but here on YouTube I have to choose my words carefully. So although the specific details will of course differ from case to case, we do in fact know quite well what happens when societies grow increasingly atheistic. We know that religion is the strongest force of communal cohesion that exists. We know that since religion underpins every civilization, atheism will lead to oikophobia. We know that the rejection of religion will lead to various superstitions that will often be held with just as fanatical a zeal. We know that since religion considers truth to be absolute, the decline of religion will lead to relativism. We know that atheism will intensify hedonism and public degeneracy. And we know that all this has already happened to societies many times before. Religion is not just about the supernatural, but also about the sacred, that around which people are able to rally and come together to endure the tragedies of life with never lost vigor. So it should be clear to everyone that the scourge of so-called wokeism that our society is currently experiencing is the modern expression of oikophobia and is a direct result of increasing atheism. And that is why some militant atheists are now softening their stance toward religion, which is a good thing, because they can see that they share with many religious people a belief in the importance of truth, argument, and patriotism. And so by looking at history, we can see that the substitution hypothesis is indeed correct. And, incidentally, as maybe some of you who are watching this happen to know, I myself am an atheist. But one must learn to see beyond oneself. Thank you.